Encoded Archival Description, EAD, Barriers to Adoption, by Kristen M. Lavoie. Although we have examined EAD in this class, we have not completely discussed the barriers to adoption that it has experienced in its 20 years. Some of them were in its early years of development, and some we are still experiencing today. It has had many advocates and positive press, but is still experiencing resistance within the archival community. The organization of this presentation is as follows. I will look at the history of encoded archival description, its development, barriers to adoption, both early in its development and later and current barriers, also current trends in EAD adoption and future of EAD within the archival community as a whole. Here is a brief history of EAD, including its definition and a discussion of the Berkeley Finding Aid Project. EAD was introduced to the archival world in 1996. The Society of American Archivists describes it as a standard used to mark up or encode finding aids that reflects the hierarchical nature of archival collections and which provides a structure for describing the whole of a collection as well as its components. EAD began at the University of California, Berkeley in 1993 by a team headed by Daniel Pitti and was named the Berkeley Finding Aid Project. Collaboration was also done at the University of Michigan on it. It was developed partially in response to a growing awareness among archivists of the need to create a standard format to describe archival findings for retrieval in an online environment. Pitti hoped to provide intellectual access to geographically distributed primary resources. Pitti recognized both the potential of the internet and how it would be revolutionary in communication and providing universal access to archival materials around the world. The why of EAD. As previously mentioned, Daniel Pitti and many others in the archival community were recognizing the incredible opportunities that the developing internet provided for distance research. EAD was also a response by the archival world to mark records. Efforts by archives to digitize finding aids using MARC had been less than satisfactory for both the archivists creating the record and researchers using the MARC record. A growing consensus among archivists in the early 1990s was that the bibliographic nature of MARC records were incompatible for archival description at a number of levels, but most significantly at the format level and the systems level. MARC was developed by librarians as a descriptive tool for creating metadata sets for inclusion in online public access catalogs, and the records were intended for the description of books and other materials which contained the same common descriptive elements. There are more representation of information products whose physical nature governs the information included in the record. In contrast to a MARC record, a finding aid contains information relating to entire collections, records, groups, and series, and the items described in finding aids are very often unique. The unique nature of archival items require accurate and thorough descriptions, which was impossible to do using MARC because it lacked the flexibility necessary. Another reason that MARC was not compatible with archival records and creating finding aids was at a system level. The limit of a MARC record is 100,000 characters, and that does not allow for the detailed description in a finding aid. By using XML for EAD instead of HTML, which is used for MARC, a more consistent appearance and formatting was available for online finding aids. EAD has been available to archivists for use since the late 1990s, and since then, its revisions have sought to increase adoption of it. In a 2015 article published in Archival Science, Gartner went as far as to describe EAD as the lingua franca for machine-readable descriptions of archival collections and their contents. Despite the literature which lauds the supposed advantages of EAD and presumably hastened its adoptions, there still exist many barriers to its use by archivists. Now we will look at some of these barriers to adoption of EAD. There were early barriers, recent and continuing barriers, and barriers that were reflective of the size and or type of institution using EAD. Early barriers to adoption were mainly related to technology, including a deficiency in editing software in XML and a lack of browsers which could support EAD. There was also a deficiency in editing software. For a number of reasons, archivists often work in isolation and do not have broad or deep habits of collaboration. Therefore, the lack of software, coupled with working alone, resulted in frustration among those attempting to adopt EAD. The cause of the frustration was twofold, and due to both a lack of time to learn how to use EAD and the lack of collaboration and support available during the initial adoption and introduction process. To varying degrees, these initial barriers have been overcome with more training tools such as Michael Fox's EAD cookbook and improved ease of electronic and other collaborative efforts, including more recently a steady growth of online resources, have mitigated the effects of the earlier barriers. Now we can look at later and continuing barriers. Some of the barriers that were identified almost 10 years after the initial introduction of EAD still was a lack of or poor training in EAD. EAD requires training in not only knowing how to convert a finding aid into an XML file, but it also requires knowing how to put it on the server. Many institutions have in fact converted finding aids to XML, but have not put them on the server, so they are accessible online. A barrier which has existed since the beginning of EAD is the perceived need to rewrite finding aids, and it continues to this day. As early as 1998, Meissner's paper, which we read in this class, First Things First, Reengineering Finding Aids for the Implementation of EAD, for the Minnesota Historical Society, recounts the difficulty in doing so and the challenges encountered by initial adopters of EAD. There have been many articles since discussing the pros and cons of converting finding aids to EAD records or creating them digitally as an EAD record. Another later and continuing barrier was the lack of administrative support for the time and cost of implementing EAD and not appreciating the importance of having finding aids available to showcase collections, and which reflected the new interest in and use of archival materials by people other than researchers, such as genealogists and history buffs. Institutional size is another later and continuing barrier to the adoption of EAD. Institutional size, such as universities and corporate archives, often have better access to funding, as well as larger staffs and greater IT support that is needed for successful use of EAD. Smaller institutions often lack the personnel and the financial overlay that a commitment to EAD entails. Regardless of the institutional size, using EAD requires a significant time commitment and reorganization of workflow to accommodate it. The future of EAD. EAD lacks semantic interoperability, which means its ability for computer systems to exchange data. This is partly due to the document-centric characteristics of EAD, which results from modeling EAD in the beginning based on the requirements of encoding the traditional features of a traditional printed finding aid. Many things have changed since 1993 to 96, when EAD was first being developed, especially in technology. The Sendari Collaborative, Sendari stands for Collaborative European Digital Archive Architecture, is working to improve the semantic interoperability between resources and libraries. Better interoperable components offers the potential for enhanced searching capabilities at an improved level than is available now with EAD. In conclusion, EAD has had a storied career in its adoption as a useful device for the conversion of and incorporation of finding aids in an online environment. Adoption of EAD has encountered many barriers since its introduction in 1996. Some of the early barriers have been surmounted, such as early technology problems lack of collaboration between archivists, and software incompatibility. Other barriers occurred later and/or are still continuing to this day. Some of these include lack of administrative support for the time and funding required to implement EAD. Another barrier is the continued debate on the necessity of converting finding aids to EAD or simply moving forward with new finding aids in EAD as they are created for new archival material. Some of the barriers mentioned, whether early on or continuing to this day, are dependent upon the size and funding of the institution as well. The archival community and the institutions it supports still face further challenges with the evolving nature of both technology and the ultimate goal of a finding aid, better access for users. Thank you. Please see the following slide for my resources.